Hey everyone, it's Kinpatsu Cosplay here, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to make an EVA foam sword using this Shira sword as an example. If you guys would like to see more cool cosplay tutorials like this one, check out our website where we have tons of great tutorials and resources for cosplay. So to build my Shira sword, I'm going to need my template, which I've printed out onto some paper and cut out. I'm then going to need a wooden stick or dowel to go through the center of the sword to add stability. And I'm going to use some 2 centimeter thick high density EVA foam. I'm taking my pattern and tracing around it onto some 2 centimeter thick EVA foam. I'm tracing around my sword twice so that I have 2 halves of my sword. To cut the pieces out, I'm taking a nice sharp craft knife and a ruler and carefully cutting the pieces out. Make sure your knife is nice and sharp so that it doesn't rip the pieces of foam and you get nice clean cuts. The piece of foam I had wasn't quite big enough for my whole sword pattern to fit onto it, so I had to cut an extra handle section which I'm going to glue into place. So the idea now is that we're going to take our 2 pieces of foam and sandwich the stick in between the 2 pieces to add extra strength and stability. I'm drawing a line down the center of one of my pieces of foam. Then, using my craft knife, I'm going to cut a channel into the center of the foam which the stick is going to sit inside of. To cut my channel, I'm just taking my craft knife and cutting at a 45-degree angle, which is making a nice V channel all the way through the sword. Just don't cut too deep because you don't want the cuts to come out the other side of the sword. Now that my channel is deep enough, I'm going to take my dowel stick and I'm going to take some contact glue and glue it into place into the sword. I'm then going to repeat this process on the second half of my sword, cutting another channel for the other half of the dowel stick to fit into so that when we sandwich the 2 pieces of foam together, they lie nice and flat and the stick is inside. Now we need to glue the 2 halves of the sword together. So to do this, I'm using contact glue. How contact glue works is you need to put glue on the one surface, glue on the other surface, let them get a little bit tacky, and then you can press them together and it forms a really strong bond. So I'm taking my tube of contact glue and I'm going to be putting it all over the one half of the sword. This takes a really long time and you can help spread out the glue with extra pieces of foam. Once I've covered both halves of my sword in glue, I then need to speed up the drying process just a little bit. So I'm taking my heat gun and gently going over the glue until it's tacky. Now that the glue is nice and tacky and sticky, I'm going to press the 2 halves of my sword together. So I'm going to line them up nice and carefully along the edges to try and get them as even as possible, and then I'm going to press the 2 halves together. Now, unless you are a laser cutter, your pieces are probably not going to line up completely perfectly and you're going to have some uneven edges. So to fix this, I'm just going to take my craft knife now and cut off any excess where the pieces have not lined up properly. The base of our sword is now complete, so we can start adding on some details. So to do this, I'm taking my pattern and I'm going to be tracing around pieces of it to draw on where I want my details to go on the sword. All the details on this sword are going to be carved into the foam itself, so there's no additional pieces that we're sticking on. So I'm taking a small craft knife and slowly and carefully carving into the foam itself and cutting away pieces to create bevels and shapes in the foam. Once again, I suggest using a really sharp knife or sharpening your knife throughout this process so that the cuts are as clean as possible. But if the cuts are not perfect and not as clean as you want them, don't worry, because I'm going to show you how to fix this and clean it up even more now. I'm also going to use my knife to carve out the basic shape of the bevels on my sword. This is going to look really rough with the craft knife because they're so small and you can't get those nice big smooth cuts on the bevels. But I'm going to show you how we're going to smooth this out in just a second. So to smooth out the surface of the sword, I'm going to be using a hand sander. A hand sander is a really great tool if you're working with larger surfaces. I normally use a rotary tool for the smaller details on my weapons, but for big surfaces like the edge of a sword, the hand sander is the best because it'll give you the smoothest finish. I'm moving this hand sander in a circular motion or back and forth over the rough edges. This is going to take a little bit of time to get it smooth, but just keep working over the surfaces until it's as smooth as you want it. When sanding EVA foam, I suggest using a dust mask and some goggles. When sanding the foam, the dust is going to go absolutely everywhere and make a huge mess, so you don't want it in your eyes and up your nose. For the smaller details where it's a little bit too hard to get in with a hand sander, you can use a rotary tool or a Dremel to go in and refine those smaller, more delicate areas. Now the sword is nice and smooth and polished. To help get off any other fluffy pieces that may have come from the rotary tool and the hand sander, I'm then using my heat gun and going over the surface, burning off any of those tiny pieces of foam. There may be some spots where you cut off a little bit too much foam or some strange seams that are not totally lining up properly. To help fill in the seams and fill in any gaps that you want to fix, you can use foam clay. I'm using foam clay from Lumen's workshop. I'm taking a little bit of the foam clay and putting it onto my seam. Then I'm taking some water and using my fingers, I'm smoothing out the clay over the surface. When this dries, the seam will be nice and hidden. I'm also going to be using some more foam clay to sculpt the pommel at the end of my sword. So I'm just taking a big ball and starting to roll it out on the table and refine the shape. I'm then going to let it dry, and once it's completely dried, I'm going to put it on top of my sword. When foam clay dries, it acts exactly like EVA foam, which is really awesome and can be used in a variety of cool ways. Now that the sword is built, it needs to be primed and prepped for paint. The one problem with EVA foam is that it looks like foam. It looks like a sponge. So we have to prep the surface and make it nice and smooth and shiny so that it looks like plastic or metal. To get my surface nice and smooth, I like to use PVA wood glue. The wood glue I use is called cold glue, and it's really great because it makes nice thick layers, and by the end of it, it looks like a nice smooth plastic finish. So I've poured some of my wood glue into a cup next to me, and then I'm taking my brush and a little bit of water and I'm spreading the glue all over the surface of the sword. Don't put too much on at a time, because if there's too much glue it can create runs and drips, and you don't want that. You want a nice smooth surface. So I'm going to paint on my first layer of wood glue and let it dry completely. When it's dry, it will go back to its original color and it won't be white anymore. I'm then going to repeat this step 6 times so that I have 6 layers of wood glue and the surface is nice and smooth and beautiful. This is what it'll look like when all the layers of wood glue are on. To get an even smoother finish on the wood glue, you can even wet sand it. So to do this, I take some sandpaper and I dip it into the water, and then in a circular motion I go all over the wood glue. You can also paint some water onto the wood glue and then sand over that. This will get rid of any other tiny bumps on the surface and make the wood glue nice and slick and shiny. Now that my sword is completely primed with wood glue, I'm going to put 1 layer of Rust-Oleum Grey primer onto the sword to prep it for paint. I'm going to start by painting the gold of my hilt. So, to prevent the gold paint from going onto the sword, I'm going to be taking some masking tape and masking off that section to protect it from my airbrush. So I've mixed up some gold paint in my Iwata airbrush and I'm going to be spraying it all over the hilt of the sword. You may need to spray a couple of layers to get the color you want. I really love painting with airbrush because it gives you a beautiful smooth finish, but you can also paint this by hand with some acrylic paints. Once I've finished painting the gold, I let it dry completely, and then I mask off the gold section so that I can paint the blue section of the sword. Once again, I've mixed up my airbrush color and I'm just slowly and carefully spraying on my layers until I get the color I want. You can then remove all the tape to reveal your final paintwork. For the final details on this sword, I used a silver Sharpie to draw on the markings, and I also used a clear acrylic egg which I got from a crafting store, and I painted the inside with some blue nail polish. This same building technique can be used for a whole range of different swords and weapons. And that's how I made this really awesome Shira sword. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like it and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Bye guys!